Anyway, here is how these matches came to be. I hate to repeat stories for the, for the older listeners that know this, but there's so many newer ones. So we'll try to go through this succinctly. I am booking and operating Smoky Mountain Wrestling in July of 1993 when I get a phone call. Tom Pritchard was one of the heavily bodies. Jimmy Del Rey had just taken over for Stan Lane the previous May. This is July. And Dr. Tom's father had come by to visit from Texas, and we had done a videotape and sent it up to Bruce, ribbing him. And so I get a phone call from Bruce at my home in Morristown, Tennessee, and he said, hey, you guys interested in coming up and making some shots? I said, what? So, well, the bodies, we need some teams. We don't have a great variety of teams. Okay, he said, first of all, he said, by the way, very funny, haha, motherfucker. I watched the tape because we were ribbing him, talking about, one of the brothers or one of the family members of the Pritchards was involved in some of that cartoon wrestling up north. So he had watched the tape and apparently didn't watch it alone because we had told him that his father did an interview on Smoky Mountain Wrestling. So in hindsight, as all this came together, I believe that because he put the tape in for who knows, Vince, Pat, all of the above, and we ribbed him, and they probably got a chuckle out of it. And then they said, well, hey, you think we might be able to get Cornette to come up here? And then Bruce said, there's almost an astronomical chance of that happening because he's running Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And that is probably when somebody said, well, what about if we recognize Smoky Mountain Wrestling and bring up some of his boys? And then Bruce knew, yes, he'll come in a heartbeat if you want to plug Smoky Mountain Wrestling and book the bodies and other talent. I didn't know this. All I got was the phone call. Ha ha, very funny, motherfucker. Hey, you guys want to make some shots? Work with the Steiners. Hey, that'd be great because we love the Steiner brothers. I did. Tom and Jimmy didn't really know them. So it was when we got to our first Raw taping we've talked about Alexandria Bay, New York. Apparently somebody wrote and said the place is either still standing or maybe it was just recently bulldozed, but it was a fucking cattle barn. And that's when Bruce took me to meet Vince. So I'd met Vince in the past and I'd met Pat, in the past briefly, but took me to talk to Vince and Pat. And that's when they pitched me the idea of, say, while you're up here, would you be interested in being the American spokesperson for Yokozuna? Because Yoko was the champion. Fuji was his manager because they fit together. But I'm not being disrespectful to Fuji. Promos were not his thing. And they really needed somebody to get the whole Yoko Luger thing over because that was what was uppermost in Vince's mind at the time. He was going to make Lex Luger the next Hulk Hogan. He did not yet know what we had found out in WCW 4 years before. This is not knocking Lex. We've talked about here on the program recently. We watched some of the matches back. Lex as a heel in 89-90 WCW was fabulous. Lex Luger was a natural heel. Every asset he had worked for being a heel and against being a babyface. And all of his weak points worked for him being a heel and against him being a babyface. He had a great physique. He had he was very intelligent. He was well-spoken. He had the big grade point average. He was aloof. He didn't connect with people on a personal basis, the fans. He wasn't ever a wrestling fan. He never got comfortable trying to be a babyface, trying to make people like him. He could go out and the way he was naturally, which was aloof and somewhat, he'd look down his nose at people, kind of just a natural thing, and he was a little brusque sometimes. It worked as a heel. Anybody that good looking, that big, that had that body, it worked as a heel because he couldn't connect emotionally with the wrestling fans. He wasn't a wrestling fan. He wasn't one of the fans. He didn't really understand the business the first few years he was in it. But he could be a fabulous heel because he was a great athlete and he could perform the shit. And when he's in there with guys like Steamboat, it was off the fucking charts, obviously. But a guy who's not comfortable talking to the fans, who's not comfortable being a babyface, trying to make people like him, who doesn't understand really how to sell and get the sympathy that guy can never be the top babyface. But Vince was looking at the picture of Lex Luger, standing there and talking to him and seeing him. You would think that. People in WCW thought it too. Only the wrestling people understood why it didn't fucking happen. So Vince was ready to make Luger the next Hulk Hogan and the champion, but he wanted to elongate the chase. I even thought it was going to take place at SummerSlam. I said, how the way they've built this guy, how can they possibly not put the belt on him? It'll kill the whole thing. As it turned out, that's what happened. But that was in the long run for the good, because Lex would not have been the top babyface. Just couldn't do it. So the reason for the match finish, as we've talked about, where Luger wins by countout, is so that they could elongate the chase of the title until the following year's WrestleMania 10. Well, by then and well before then, Vince had got tired of the new toy and had seen that it wasn't going to work, because remember, when Lex left WCW, he sat out of wrestling a year. He'd had that motorcycle wreck. He had a fucking plate put in his arm. And then he signed with Vince, the World Bodybuilding Federation, where Vince could sign him for another endeavor and bring him into the family. The World Bodybuilding Federation fell apart and self-destructed. But then he made Lex the narcissist as a heel. That was more suited to Lex Luger. But that didn't last until he got the idea to make him a babyface.
And that sucked. I got to say, the narcissist was just an awful gimmick. It was
an awful gimmick because it took what you didn't need to state and stated it out in front of everybody, just made Luger look like an idiot. Yes, he's a guy that looks in the mirror all the time. And yes, he does love his body and his physique, but it made it phony instead of real. You could have done that with Lex and it'd have been real, but they carried it too far and made it phony. But so anyway, he had almost a year off of wrestling, then a short time as a heel. Then he switches babyface, and now he's working with Yokozuna. And Yoko was a tremendous worker and had great matches with people who complimented his style. But he and Lex had somewhat of a style clash. Yoko moved faster than Lex did at that point in time, as we will see here shortly. But anyway, that's why this screwy finish, there was a stipulation. We had stacked the deck against the babyface. He was never going to get another chance at the title. This was his only one. He had to wear an elbow pad over the metal plate that they'd put in his arm so he couldn't hit his metal-assisted forearm finish he'd been using. And it was all stacked against him, which was telegraphing that he would have to win this. And that's what the people came to see. He won the match, but not the title. And you see the fans start cheering. And then as the celebration goes on longer and longer, they start realizing, wait a minute, this dumb shit doesn't realize he didn't win the belt. And it was flat. And then Vince lost interest. And by the next WrestleMania, Luger was just on the card. He wasn't even figured in. Really.
Well, I mean, he was in the three-way to set up the match.
He was in the three-way to set up the, but it was... he was in that at that time more to get him out of the title picture than because he was in it. It was like we're closing up this chapter and we're going to Yoko and Brett and these guys. You see what I'm saying? So he was there, but it was not his moment anymore. It was to set up the other thing. Anyway, so that was the Luger and Yoko match, and I took over and did the promos for the month leading up to that. And the Regis and Kathy Lee that we've talked about recently. And I didn't know how long it was going to go, but obviously as we put things together later on, they would have told me up front if they thought I would have gone for it. They got me and the bodies up there, knowing that, okay, Smoky Mountain Wrestling is going to be talked about, and we're giving the bodies some work, so Jim will be in a good mood. And then they hit, which I didn't mind working with Yoko. It was a great deal at a great spot, and they needed somebody, but they kind of slid me into it. And then it ended up lasting until they switched Yoko. So they switched Yoko, and I got Vader and a blah, 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 and Bulldog Owen. With the bodies and the Steiners, this is a real quick set. There was almost no setup to this match. I think we jumped them on television and roughed them up and got some heat on them. when they were wrestling some job guys and challenged them and did some promos. That was basically it. But it was the Palace of Auburn Hills is suburban Detroit. The Steiners are from Michigan, so it was the hometown crowd. They were always having issues with the Steiners because Steiners wanted to be presented in a more real wrestling atmosphere and had learned how to get over and the way things were done in the NWA. And so they were never really happy with the booking and the fact that, it was just a completely different style. So they needed a team to put the Steiners over, and we had no problem doing that. We're just happy to be there. But also the Steiners had no problem working with the Bodies because even though they'd met Tom, they didn't know Jimmy, but we had worked with them, me and the Midnight in WCW. And I just went to Rick and Scott. I said, hey, you've worked with the Midnight Express. It's the same concept team. They don't do the same moves, but it's the same concept. We're going to have the fucking match where we fucking fly for you guys and they fucking do all your shit. And then here's what the fucking Bodies do to get heat. And we knew that they would sell for us because it was going to be 2-on-1 or cheating or blind tagging or heel shit. And we're going to set them up for a big fucking comeback and a big win in front of their hometown crowd with their mother and their sister sitting at ringside. So they're ready to do whatever. They knew they weren't going to have any problems with another team sandbagging them or wanting to look strong because of their spot in the WWF. We were business, and it was a Midnight Express match with the Heavenly Bodies. And as we'll see when we watch that, Tom was bothered. I can't remember whether it was a quad or a hamstring, but he's got a brace on his right leg, his thigh. And he was like, shit, we couldn't be in Morristown, right? I've got a bad leg. We got to be on pay-per-view. But he performed admirably through it. And Jimmy Del Rey, that was the dream of his life, because this is August of 93. In April, he'd been working independent shows in Florida and had never been on fucking television in the previous 10 years, right? And suddenly he's on WWF pay-per-view challenging for the tag team title. So, of course, he's going to do everything he can do. So anyway, Steiners, we loved working with them. They loved working with us because they knew it wasn't going to be any funny business and everybody was going to be put in the right fucking position. And the only thing I regret about the Steiners Bodies match on my part is that I could interfere, but I couldn't take any bumps because I had to come back out with Yoko later on and Luger was going to fucking bump me or whatever. So otherwise we'd have had the full fucking Tennessee tag team treatment in this match. But basically that's it. Nobody believed the Bodies were going to win. But I think they were surprised that it was a good match and that, how easily everybody worked with the Steiners, which is probably why we got very few of those matches anymore. And I think they ended up putting the belts on the fucking Quebecers. The Palace of Auburn Hills drew a sellout crowd. It was announced like all WWF shows at like 23,000 something. That was not the case. I don't know how many were there because this was before I was in creative, so I don't have the inside info on the gate and the building rent and all that stuff. But the Palace was full, and it was probably mostly paid, but I would say, 19,000, maybe 20. It's an NBA building. It wasn't 23 something. And is there any other information I have not covered yet, Brian?
Obviously, you have a neck brace on. That's another big thing for the match. Yeah,
well, yes, I have a neck brace on because we had just done the big match between me and Bob Armstrong 2 weeks previously in Knoxville. And I was off Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I was sending in tapes while I was convalescing. And I told him, I said, hey, I got to have a neck brace at SummerSlam. Okay, well, then with Regis and Kathy Lee, I got to have a neck brace. Okay. But Vince even refers to it. Vince and Heenan doing the commentary. Bobby was fucking brilliant, but right at the start, as I'm making the introduction, Vince refers to some problems I got into in the Smoky Mountain area in that voice of his. And then, of course, he claims I'm trying to, work some kind of insurance scam, and Bobby defends me for it and everything. But that's why I'm wearing the neck brace. And I sell my neck a couple times during the course of the thing when I get moving around too fast. Anything else I didn't cover?
When this event happened, the people who stole the show, in the smart fans' eyes, were Jerry Lawler, and they did a match with Jerry Lawler versus Bret Hart, but Lawler comes out on crutches, says he can't wrestle, he's been in an accident. Doink the Clown, Matt Bourne, who was a great worker,
right,
ends up having this really good match with Bret, and then it's revealed that Jerry can wrestle, and they have the match.
Because after the match with Bret and Doink, Lawler jumps in the ring, and he's got two good legs, and he starts beating the piss out of Bret with his fucking crutches. And then they have a big pull apart, and the match starts, but Bret wins the match with the sharpshooter, but then keeps the hold on for a while. And he says in his book he was really sitting back on it, because Bret Hart and Jerry Lawler, there could not be two more different human beings. And whereas Lawler was just effortless, natural, and master of psychology and could get the most out of the least, Bret worked as hard as he fucking could, right? It was two completely different. And so Bret fucking set back on that goddamn sharpshooter, and Lawler was fucking anxious to get out of that thing. So anyway, the referee reverses the decision, disqualifies Bret, and Lawler wins. But that whole thing, Lawler as soon as he got there in 92 until 94 or 95, when I guess the newness got off of it for him, and they stopped putting him in a lot of that stuff, he was the best worker in the WWF because all of his shit was different than anything anybody else did. And it all looked good. It was all classic pro wrestling. So I invite anybody to watch. That was the last big run, good run of his career. It was just brilliant. And he could talk and cut promos, and Vince wouldn't tell him what to say, because even Vince knew, I can't tell Lawler what to say. Nobody can. So all the promos just blew everybody else out of the water on the microphone.
That match and that angle into the match was one of the highlights of the show. Lawler was one of the best performers on the show. Sorry to use the term performer, but you know what I mean. Bret Hart was fantastic.
Just don't say performance.
But in terms of performance, the person who shocked everyone was Jimmy Del Rey. Yeah. If you were a tape trader, you maybe just saw him entering as one of the Heavenly Bodies. Because, it wasn't like the show aired and the next week the tape was going around. It usually took a little bit of time for Smoky Mountain TV to get into circulation. WWF fans had no idea who he was. So for a lot of people, it was the first opportunity to see Jimmy Del Rey. People knew Stan Lane. People may have seen Tom Pritchard. No one had seen Jimmy Del Rey. Or, he was Jimmy Backlund years earlier on TV doing job matches. He shocked a lot of people. A lot of people thought he was the best in-ring wrestler on the entire show.
Yeah. And looked like shit. And Vince McMahon had to be going, oh my God, because he was the antithesis of who Vince thought a wrestler should look like. But he outperformed everybody because this was his chance, and he was always able to do this stuff. He just never had a platform. And Kevin Sullivan is the one, when Stan decided he was going to quit the business, Kevin Sullivan said, I got a heavenly body for you, Jimmy. And Jimmy Backlund from Florida, he can do everything, Jimmy. And son of a bitch, he could.
The other note is, leading into this match, it is a hometown match for the Steiners. They interview the Steiner brothers' mother and sister, who proceeds to use their real names and say Rob and Scott instead of Rick and Scott. But I guess that's the other note I would have.
Yeah, and then my introduction cuts them off, but we played to them at ringside, and their sister was quite an attractive young lady, so she was easy to look at. But anyway, the only other thing I'll say, and then we'll go into the countdown, is the way we put this match, the reason why we put this match together this way. I had nothing to do with putting Lex Luger and Yoko together. That was Pat Patterson was the head agent. I was just visiting at that point. I knew Lex, but hadn't worked with Yoko and Fuji. But for a month, I wasn't going to stick my nose in. But for the Bodies and the Steiners, I'm the Bodies manager. They didn't really know the Bodies or what they could do, but I knew Rick and Scott. So I said, here's what we need to do. It's your hometown, so people are going to be interested in y'all, but nobody's seen us. We've just been on TV for the past couple of weeks. So we're going to jump you at the start and get some steam up on you and make it look like holy shit, and then give you the fucking comeback at the start where boom, shit happens and then we bail out and now the people are hopefully hooked on the match and what's going to happen. You guys have a bit of a reason to get mad. Then we're going to fucking slow it down a little bit. We're going to shine the baby faces and make sure that everybody in Michigan knows that the Steiners can do all this shit. And then we're going to fucking cheat and we're going to get the fucking heat on one of you. And here's what we do during the heat. And this works, blah, blah, blah. And how can we work everything out here? And then the big comeback and boom, boom, boom. And we had a nice little fucking finish where they go over, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and make everybody happy. But still, we acquitted ourselves as a top team in the 10 minutes that we were given. And so there was a lot of this was Tom and Jimmy calling it as they went along. We didn't sit down and go foot for foot back in those days. We had the start. We had a couple of things that you'll see that would require some, some advanced knowledge. The heat spot, which is a blind tag and a double team, and then the fucking finish. And the Steiners let Tom and Jimmy lead it from there because they trusted us that we were going to do what we had always done, but my teams had always done before. So that's the way we didn't start out just like both teams were over and the heels could automatically start shining the baby faces because people really didn't know us, as you mentioned. So that's why we put the dust up in at the start to kind of hook them and get them into it, and then we can go from there. All right.